Mai sunt 100 de zile până la alegeri și deja se accelerează mesajele care încurajează cetățenii să meargă să voteze. Pe 9 iunie se decide dacă Europa va fi condusă în continuare de forțele democratice sau va fi mult mai influențată de cele extremiste, care vor mai puține libertăți. Stephen Clark este directorul biroului de legătură al Parlamentului European și discutăm împreună despre importanța acestor alegeri. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport Diplomatic. Stephen Clark, Director of the European Parliament Liaison Offices, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you. It's pleased to be here.
1st of March is the date that starts the counting for the 100 days till the European elections. Let's just hope that everyone will go there and vote. You were responsible for the campaign in 2014 and 2019. What do you think it will happen this year?
I wish I had a crystal ball and I could say. What we've seen over the last two elections, particularly, of course, the last time, was that a significant increase in voter turnout. I think maybe that was in part due to our campaign, but I think it's also a sign of the times. I think it's a recognition by voters in general that these are elections, these are mainstream elections, they matter, they make a difference. And the reason behind that, I believe, is that the big stories of our times are stories which have to be handled at the European level. So if you think about what you see on the news, obviously the Russian aggression in Ukraine, climate, all the problems around the climate, cost of living crisis, migration, all of these issues, they are things that go beyond what any single member state can handle. So it's relatively, I think, easy for people to understand that we need to be thinking more European these days. And it's starting to become more natural for people to do that. Maybe also, I think, this year, 2024, the press is talking a lot about this being the super electoral year. Half of humanity will be voting and so on.
It is a super electoral year.
Exactly. It's a kind of a narrative which is getting people, okay, I don't want to overplay this, but getting people interested and even slightly excited about the idea of democracy and voting, and perhaps looking at the wider perspective, thinking about how important it is to maintain those systems, to defend the democratic system against other systems which are perhaps thriving, I might say, in the world at the moment. So, there is something here to defend, there is something at stake.
But do you think that this very optimistic message that you just explained, that people care more about democracy, or they should care more about democracy, it's really understood? Because if we really look to the realities, if you look to the realities of polls, to the realities of some countries that already voted, there is a lot of disinformation involved in this campaign. Disinformation involved in electoral campaigns is nothing new. But when it comes to Brussels policies, to what European Union does, the message doesn't really get through. I mean, Brussels is still seen as a sort of dictatorship, and everyone seems to, to want to get rid of the dictatorship.
I don't think there is this view of Brussels as a dictatorship, and I don't think...
It is in Romania.
There's maybe parts of society that see things that way, and I agree that the positive message I gave about participation is actually in many senses attributable to rather bad things that are going on in the world. The first one I mentioned was the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So this is not a good thing. It's something we wish had never happened, but it is something which is focusing people's minds on the role of Europe and the importance of Europe. Also, disinformation. I mean, and things that it gives rise to, such as an increase in extremism and political extremism, and attitudes such as those you mentioned, these are all things which, as it were, create an interest in Europe. I think it's for other people, not the extremists, to take the opportunity to talk about Europe in a different way, in a more moderate, reasonable way, but not only in a moderate and reasonable way, also in a more passionate way. I think this is important. I think you mentioned disinformation. Disinformation is there, it exists, it's a major problem.
Forever, yeah, it's not new.
As you say, it's always existed, but the tools and mechanisms by which it can spread are now so much more sophisticated. And Brussels, if you want to use that word as a metaphor, the fact that it is worth people attacking Brussels, I think, is also a sign of the fact that, yes, the European level has become so much more important and visibly important, so that actors, both inside and outside the European Union, have an interest in propagating disinformation about Brussels. This is not a superstate, it is not a dictatorship, it is sometimes a rather slow, compromise-based organization which has many challenges in front of it. It is an organization which is composed of politicians from at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the European level. All of these things come together. That's what makes it so complicated. It makes it difficult to understand, and that is one of the reasons that it's vulnerable to this kind of misinformation. Now, our job as communicators is to try and get across that somehow, and one of the ways of doing so is not always to be exclusively rational. I mean, we need to be rational, but exclusively rational, only talk about the benefits and the reasons for Europe at a rational level, but also at a more emotional level, because that's how a lot of disinformation works too. It's about identity, it's about exploiting people's fears, maybe their prejudices, and so on. We need to be working at a level of emotion, connecting with people, helping them understand that they can identify as Europeans. So I think, we have a big job ahead of us, but it's not impossible. I wouldn't characterize things being quite as bad as you said. There are parts of society which are very antagonistic towards the European Union and its institutions, and there are other parts which are quite the opposite. And if you look at the polling figures, if you go into the sort of what you might call the more scientific approach to looking at where public opinion is, you will see that across Europe there is still a huge majority of people who favour the European Union, who favour their country belonging to the European Union. In some places this number has declined, in some places it has gone up. It's interesting to see that Brexit has produced an increase in those numbers in many places. But this is the rough and tumble of politics. That's how it works. From our point of view as institutional communicators, what we say is there isn't a particular direction that Europe needs to go in. We don't have political answers to propose. But what we do say is there is a system, there's a democratic system, there is a European democracy. If we engage in that democracy and everyone engages it, we can make it go where we want it to go.
Young generations and young people are usually the target for the disinformation, because they are the ones using most the social media platforms. In the same time, this message is coming from European Union doesn't really reach them. They still consider Brussels being boring, European policies being hard to understand. How do you reach them?
Okay, well, obviously we do have a great interest in talking to young people, and there are many reasons for that. Firstly, young people tend to be very motivated. They do believe in political causes. They have things that they want to change about the world. They are concerned. I think we actually have quite a politically active generation. However, that is very often disconnected from not only Brussels or European politics, but indeed from what you might call traditional party politics in general, which is perceived often as something for older people, as something that's quite technical and maybe slow and based on compromise and so on, which is, as you say, can be seen as a bit boring. What we do with young people is try to explain to them through different channels, we can go into that, about why it's important for them to get engaged in this kind of politics, because that's the way you make your voice heard, and it is possible. And what we saw actually in the last European elections is, I said turnout went up, it went up 8 points, but amongst young people it went up 14 points. So that proportionately there was a bigger surge in young people going to vote than in general. And I think that was a reflection of a recognition by many young people, now still not a majority of young people, about the importance of political participation. And I think there was the mobilization of them last time round was a lot to do with a perceived threat, that there were a lot of people around challenging the idea of Europe and therefore also challenging the idea of the opportunities that young people get from Europe. And I think one of our easier messages is that for young people, Europe does provide many opportunities that can go away rather too easily. And I say that as a Brit, and looking at my home country, I can only regret the loss of opportunity for many young British people when it comes to, working, travelling, studying, living abroad in all kinds of different ways.
Well, you said that they went to vote in 2019 in larger numbers because they felt that Europe is being threatened. Now the number of the people threatening Europe is even larger. In the same time, it was this message, this time I will vote. It was used in 2019. Do you think that the same situation will repeat now in 2024?
I am optimistic. I'm an optimistic person, but I am optimistic that we will see turnout go up again, and I very much hope that we will see it go up amongst young people. I think the arguments are just too convincing, and I detect this time around a passion and an interest in these elections that even in 2019 wasn't there.
May I ask you how you detect it?
Well, I detect it, for example, I mentioned polling already.
Yeah.
So if you look at the figures, does Europe affect your life? Is it important for us to be in the European Union? Do you think the Parliament should have a bigger role? All of these things are on upward trends. And that is a sign that there is an engagement with Europe. Then I've mentioned the media coverage of this super electoral year. And there's a lot of talk of democracy as such. This is new. We didn't have that before. And I think it's because there is a perceived threat to democracy. And, if you look out into the world, and this is the third time I've mentioned the Russian attack on Ukraine, but misinformation is an attack on democracy as well. So the stakes, I think, are higher and are perceived as being higher. And in the political world, the political rhetoric around these elections is going up. It's getting heated, and we're still, we're 100 days out from the elections, which perhaps in the olden days would have been still quite a long way to go. I think people now see these elections as quite imminent.
Extremists have now a new approach when it comes to European Union. They don't want anymore to exit. They don't want anymore to leave European Union because they do understand the advantages of being inside the EU, but they ask for some sort of reforms, but their way of reforms, which mainly means to attack democracy.
The first thing I have to say, this is an important point, that what we do as an institutional communication service is talk about the importance of democracy and participation. We're not taking a political view, right, left, centre, whatever it might be. And we mustn't do that. That's very important that we don't do that. The politicians, they will have their arguments about politics. Now, when we talk about extremism, what are we actually talking about? What I would say is, if I have to sort of define extremism, I would say people who don't share the fundamental values that we are all signed up to as Europeans, which include democracy, it includes all kinds of human rights and so on. So if people are questioning those, I think it's legitimate for us to say this is something which, as an institution, we cannot favour, we cannot support that and so on. If people are talking about political direction within the European Union, then it's a legitimate political debate, and we're not going to get involved in that. So we have to be a little bit careful. We are not here to fight any particular political orientation, but we are worried about people who would question the fundamental values that we live by, and we support those values. So our role is to be out there to saying political participation is important, democracy is important, democracy in Europe is important. The more people participate in that, the stronger it will be. And yes, there are attacks on that. And I've mentioned Ukraine, I've mentioned disinformation and extremism, the kind of extremism which goes beyond the bounds of, the values which we all believe we respect. That is also a threat to democracy.
You are working for the European Parliament for a very long time, so you know very well the system. As you already mentioned, we don't talk about politics, but now we have to talk about the system. Will the checks and balances of the European institutions resist to whatever extremism inside European Parliament can do?
I think so. We're in a democratic system. It's a system which has its checks and balances, and if you I've seen the Parliament evolve over time. It is certainly, what we've seen certainly is a fragmentation politically of the chamber. There was once upon a time, when I started working in the European Parliament, the two largest groups accounted for something like 80% of all the votes in the Parliament, which meant it operated largely on a left-right dynamic. We now have, in order to reach a 50% threshold, a majority of the Parliament, we have 4 political groups, what you might call in the mainstream, coming together to do that. And then there are others in the chamber who are outside that mainstream grouping, who play their role, but at the moment they are not in a controlling position. The controlling position remains this sort of what you might call broadly centrist coalition of political groups. Let's see what happens in the elections. I mean, the voters have to decide. I think, however, an institution and the system is a very effective way of bringing together different views and finding a way to take things forward. It could get more complicated. It could be more difficult to take decisions if people if the House is more divided than it is at the moment. But at the end of the day, I think people will realise those decisions have to be taken, and there will be a lot of public pressure on the Parliament to get the business done. And I think if you look at the history of the last 10 years, you will see that the EU has had to react to some quite extreme situations. You know, crisis after crisis, starting in 2008 with the financial crisis. We had problems with migration, perceived by many as a crisis. There was the COVID crisis and the Ukraine crisis. All of these things, I think we've seen Europe get better at dealing with these situations, and the necessity of European action in response to those things becoming more and more evident. So there is a level of expectation that has built up about what Europe, in the sense of the European institutions, will do, that will not allow parliamentarians or anyone else to sit on their hands and, you know, let things just roll. The system will continue to function, I'm convinced of it. And then if you can look at polls and you can see how the political balances might work out, and, you know, most scenarios that I see don't indicate a sort of breakdown of the system to me.
Because you mentioned during our talk Russia, the Russian threat a few times, and it's good to be mentioned and it's good to be remembered. They are very good when it comes to disinformation. How this disinformation done by the Russians affect the way that the European institutions communicate? So far, they seem to have many more followers. As
institutional communicators, we have to be fair, we have to be honest. We cannot play, we can't use some of the tactics that disinformation people use.
Absolutely,
I mean, you can't descend to that level. You can't justify descending to a level of disinformation yourself, as it were. So, but I think it is a wake-up call for communicators in general that we need to be better at getting across our case, and we need to do it in a way which is not the same as, but starts to bear some similarities to the way that disinformation works. So in other words, not only deal in rational explanations and facts, and they are important and we should always treasure facts, but also be willing to talk in more emotional terms and connect with people at the level of identity. European identity is not a bad thing. It's something that we can all share and that can coexist with whatever other identities we have. And I think we're all in ourselves perfectly aware that it's perfectly possible to be, you know,
Romanian and
a proud
European,
member of your local municipality, Romanian and European. These things are not incompatible. I am British. I still like all kinds of strange British things that British people like. It doesn't stop me being a European. So, you know, this is a way forward. So we need to be talking to people at that level. Of course, we also need to be dealing with taking on disinformation. But as you say, the sheer volume and the skill and the insidiousness of the way this is done means that you can't deal with it only that way. It's also, you have to have as strong a story as the bad guys. And you mentioned Russian disinformation. They obviously play to what they perceive as potential weak points in cultures or in different countries around Europe. But it's not only Russians. There's plenty of disinformation which is homegrown, and we need to think about that as well. So let's not put it all, say it doesn't all come from St. Petersburg, as it were.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de X. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!